Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join my talk today. This is DevOps 101, Git for Admins. My name is Jack McCurdy, so I'm one of the enterprise account executives at GearSet. I spent the last 2 years speaking to admins, developers, platform owners, everybody that's involved in the Salesforce ecosystem, developing their instances for their organizations, and spend a lot of time talking to them about their deployment strategies. A lot of times, and more commonly these days, that is involving things like version control and continuous integration and all these exciting things that developers are used to, but admins maybe not so much. So the purpose of this talk today is primarily for you guys to be able to explain what Git is at the end of it, to be able to understand at a high level how Git works, for us to understand the benefits of using Git and why everybody is talking about this right now and why it's becoming such a prevalent topic and why your developers and platform owners and whoever else it might be imploring that we get on board with this. And then at the end of this, hopefully what you'll be able to do is understand, is Git worth it for us? And do we want to look at, if we don't use it already, look at taking that on? So that is, broadly speaking, why we're here today. And hopefully you can use this session to inform what your strategy might be going forward, or if you have already decided to undertake Git, and that is a project that you're working on right now, hopefully you'll be a little bit more familiar and that task will be a little less daunting for you. So most of us, when we start thinking about anything, will go away and Google it. And the most common place that we end up after Googling is Wikipedia. So if we go into Google and we type in, what is Git? Wikipedia will give us the definition that Git is a distributed version control system for tracking changes in any set of files, originally designed for coordinating work among programmers cooperating on source code during software development. Now, it's not too uncommon for that to elicit some kind of response like this. If you've not already come across some of these concepts before, that can leave a lot of head scratching and a bit of confusion about how we apply that to what we do with Salesforce. So what we might need to do is unpack it a little bit. So if we take this statement and take a few key pieces out of this definition, the first that we have is distributed version control system. The version control is a system that records changes to a file or a set of files over time so that you can recall specific versions later. Distributed means that it can be accessed from its hosted location and locally. So that's the first bit that we need to kind of think about and break down there to help us understand this as a whole. Mentioned in distributed version control system, we have files. So files are individually separated blocks of features that make up your org configuration. So for example, in version control and in Git, your account object will be a file. So that will include all of its custom fields and customization that you've added to that object as well. Also within Git, those files will live in potentially folders, and your Git repository will have some kind of structure. But ultimately, we're looking at recording changes to the sets of files, your account object, opportunities, flows, etc. Programmers, this is a slightly easier one. So this is us, this is you, your fellow admins, your developers, architects, myself. We're all in Salesforce programmers in this traditional explanation. And then finally here, the last thing that we're looking at is source code. So most things that we do, declarative or otherwise, live as code in Salesforce. Even though we're making changes throughout Salesforce's UI, in the backend, that lives as code. So those declarative configuration and those changes that we are making live in Git as XML. This reference to source code is taken from more traditional software development, where you have a source code which makes an application run. So this is where this comes from. So there we have it. So with those definitions and a little bit more of explanation, we can kind of start to get a feel for what Git is and how we might like to think about how this operates and what the benefits could eventually be for us. So thinking about what does all this mean, in simple terms, Git allows us to track changes over time. So if we think of your org, production, your sandboxes, they're living, breathing entities. When we're making changes to them, they change over time in real time. So what Git allows us to do is make those changes and see over time how your org's changed, which we currently don't have the ability to really do. Even if you're looking through the history of any given object, that's really difficult to do to see what's happened to it. So Git allows us to track those changes over time to each of those objects. And those changes can be annotated, accounted for, and approved. So when we think about making those changes in our orgs, might not always be clear who made the change, why they made the change, or have any real link to your application lifecycle management tool that you might be using, Jira, etc., to understand why those changes were made. So that is something that Git will also allow us to do. And then Git can be accessed from anywhere. So part of that distributed model means that we can access Git from where it's hosted and also locally on your computer as well. So that's really helpful when it comes to being able to replicate some features that we need for development or what have you. We can get to this where we need to get to it from. So we need to start thinking about how does this actually work then? So to get us started, we need one of these. So this is what most people will think about when they think about what Git is. They're going to usually be thinking about one of these providers, GitLab, GitHub, etc. So GitHub and its friends are Git-based version control systems. And each of those systems will ultimately have a different UI, but will do the same thing. It will all depend on what your preference is in terms of the UI, into which ones you might use. You might have other areas of the business that already use one of these providers for other application development in your companies, or you may have specific security requirements that means one of these providers is better suited to your organization or what have you. So that's what we need, first of all, to get us started. Once you have one of those in place, how do we use it? So Salesforce is a little bit different to traditional software development in terms of how we might traditionally use it. So first, what we need to do is we need to extract the metadata from the orgs to be able to start using Git in the way that it's intended. So when we extract metadata from our orgs and those declarative configuration changes that we might be making, it's extracted as XML. So this is what the changes live as behind the scenes in Salesforce. Traditionally, that is done with a command line interface tool, Ants, the DX CLI. You might have heard your developer colleagues talking about. And these CLIs have quite a big learning curve, especially if you're not used to coding and using a command line interface. That can be quite a daunting task to be able to get that metadata using those commands out of your orgs and back into version control and using that interaction. So that's why tools like GearSet, ClickDeploy, a bunch of others out there as well, help flatten that learning curve by giving you a click, not code UI to be able to do that. So in Git, you will have a repository. So your repository is effectively your org, so production, for example. In your repository, we work with branches. Now, depending on the size of your team and the complexity of the project work that you might be doing, you will always have a main branch or master branch, it's traditionally been called. And then you might, or will probably definitely be developing in what we call feature branches. So this is where we will be adding new functionality and doing that in isolation in those branches. And then, like I say, depending on the complexity of your org structure and your development cycle, you may also have branches for your UAT environment or staging environments, or on larger teams, you may even find, if you're working in a sprint cadence, that you have a release branch which will go to production at the end of your sprint every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever that looks like. And to use this and to leverage some of this capability, we commit, or that is to say, save the changes that we're making in our branch before we open a pull request, and then we merge that back into the branch that we need to eventually deploy to production if we're following that change lifecycle and not making those changes directly in production. So that's how we use it, and I appreciate that talking it through and looking at it in bullet point form is a little bit hard to understand what's going on. So if we take a look at what XML is, this is what XML looks like. So you can see here that this is a checkbox that I have created on my account object in Salesforce. And you can see here that we've got the name of the component. The default value for the checkbox is unchecked or false. We don't have an external ID. Its label is just demo checkbox. It's got no track feed history. And you can see the type there of component that it is a checkbox. So that's all pretty simple. And the more experience that you have in using Git and version control and working with it, you will get to understand what these components look like. So simply starting here with a checkbox, what does that look like in the back end? This is what it looks like in the back end. And once you get more familiar, you'll start to understand what what you do in the front translates to what you will see in Git and the complexity of different components. Ultimately, this can all be broken down, and it's one of those things. The more you do it, the more you start to understand, and the more comfortable you will be with how that looks. So this is what a simple user story looks like. So if we're thinking about creating a new feature for our end users, this is how we integrate what we're doing with a version control system. So if I use my pointer here, you will see that we have a master branch that I mentioned. So this is the main branch, and this is what we will be using to deploy to production from. So with version control, what we do is we create a new branch from master. And what that will mean is, because master is a replication of what production looks like, this is what we will be developing from. And then what we want to do with this feature branch, which is where we're going to put our new components and our new development in, we're going to update our developer environment. So this could be your dev sandbox or your full or partial copy, depending on the complexity of your deployments and where you do those from. We update that from that feature branch so that we're making sure that we're working with all the most up-to-date production-like components. And then we do our development in our sandbox as we usually do. We add our fields or change our permissions, whatever it might be. And then what we do is we commit or save those changes back into the feature branch. And that's done by, like I say, either using the CLI tool or a DevOps tool of your choice. And then what we do when we are ready and when we are comfortable that we have saved the last of our changes back into our feature branch that might be associated with a particular user story or user stories, we are then ready to open a pull request and merge that back into the master branch, ready for deployment out into production. Now, if you're working in a team, it might look like something more like this. So here you will start to see some of the benefits of, if you are working with others in your company on various features and what have you, this is what it could potentially look like most simply for you. So you will notice here that we have that familiar user story that I just mentioned there. So both of us are working off our master branch and what production looks like. You can see me as an admin working in my sandbox and making sure I'm up to date, and then committing or saving my features back into my own feature branch. And at the same time, you can see I'm working with a developer here who has also created his own feature branch to make sure that he's got the most up to date production metadata, and then is working in his sandbox and using his development environment to perhaps make a new Apex class, maybe making some new Lightning Web Components or whatever that might be, doing those changes, and then using his CLI to push those changes back down into his feature branch or other DevOps tool. And you can see both of us opening pull requests here and another pull request here, and merging that back into master for deployments. Now, at the end of the cycle here, we've got a couple of other steps in in the process here for what a deployment might look like. You can see here that we've got a continuous integration step to push this out to a staging environment or deployment package ready to go with those changes the admin I have made and my developer has made to go out to UAT and then eventually to production. So you can see here that what both of us are doing is operating in isolated feature branches, which gives us some really nice benefits actually, so that we can make sure that what we are doing and the features that we need to eventually get into our end users' hands, that development is not interrupted and we're doing the right things and making sure that we're all on the same page. So if we talk about some of these benefits, Git is actually quite a big deal. So Git's number one benefit is that it allows you to collaborate better with your colleagues. And if you've come across Git before or heard your team talking about version control before, the main thing that you'll hear them talking about is the ability to identify conflicts. So being able to identify those conflicts will allow you to prevent your work from being overwritten. So if you think back to the diagram I was just showing you where I was operating in my feature branch and my developer was operating in their feature branch, that allows both of us to work independently of each other, make changes to effectively the same production environment, and then push those changes back into production. And if there is a discrepancy and we have both made changes to the same thing, we can identify that before we try and then deploy it to production. And that'll prevent your changes being overwritten, you overwriting developers' changes or vice versa. And it'll allow you to collaborate better and understand what has changed and who might need to actually adapt what they've done to accommodate the other changes and the best way to move forward with that. So the really common bugbear of most Salesforce teams is that you've done something and then another person overwrites it by deploying your change set on top of that, or just making that change in production and overwriting some work that's already been done. So that's the number one benefit and why we want to use version control is to identify this change. And this is something really common in traditional software development and a really big way of making sure that application development goes smoothly. With Git, that also allows us to have all of our change documentation in one place. So every time that you commit or save those changes back down into your feature branch and open a pull request for merge, what you're able to do is add comments and annotate each of those changes in Git so that every change that you make is tracked, annotated, accounted for. You can paste links to your ALM tool in there as well, so it'll link out to the user story that you've been working on and why those changes have been made. But basically what it allows us to do is comment on every individual change that we've made and give you really lots of rich detail to understand why those things have been done. And that will then build up over time to give you a rich history of your org's transformation over 6, 9, 12 months, a year, 5 years, however long far back your org goes. And then you can understand why things have been done at every single step of the way. So that means that your product owner or head of IT or VP or whoever it is, if they're involved in this process and want to understand why, just because we can't find out why something has been changed in Salesforce, if you're using Git, you can go back and say, okay, well, this change was made for this reason. This is why we went with this developer's change over that admin's change, or this admin's change over that developer's change, etc. So really useful for providing rich context and making sure that you have a backup of the reasons why you've done things, and allow you to have all that detail there. We're going to improve our reliability by working with Git as well. So having those branches will allow you to test your features and your new development in isolation. So in those feature branches that we had in the diagrams that I showed you, we were working in our feature branch and we had our sandbox that we were working in to push those changes to and from. And while we're doing that, what we're able to do is in our own sandboxes is test that feature and understand that feature works. And then when that's ready, then merge it back into the main branch, which I was doing. Or if you have a more complex environment, you might have a branch that matched up to your UAT environment or your pre-production environment. So then that can go there for additional testing and allowing you to have really good control over the quality of the features that you're developing for your developers, the quality of the code that they're writing, and allow you to test those individually before pushing them up the chain, or doing a big bang deployment every 2 weeks where everything might only get one chance to be tested in one go. So really nice way to improve your reliability in what you're doing there. And ultimately, this will give you resilience as well. So having all of your changes tracked over all of this time is a massive benefit if something goes wrong. So if we think back to Paramageddon that happened a couple of years ago with all those permission changes, or you have an integration that breaks your org for whatever reason and corrupts it, having everything stored in Git in one place and allowing you to go back to certain points in time where you know at this point the code was good and the org worked and functioned really well at this point, that allows you to then use that as a basis to restore metadata in production to that working state should something go wrong. So one of the really big benefits there as well. And ultimately, Git is going to be the start of the journey. So in that last diagram that I showed you that we had a continuous integration step, and that is the natural development of how we think about DevOps and how teams like to accelerate their release cycles. So we might be at the beginner stage right now, so we just use change sets or work directly in our production orgs or sandboxes with a long time between refreshes. When we introduce Git, we can start to get subsets of metadata and version control, get familiar with the basics, and then as we get more familiar with that, we start to use Git as source of truth for our development, allow us to get on that journey to allow continuous integration and start deploying automatically to test environments, or maybe even get to the stage where we're continuously validating all of our development to production. So Git is the core thing that is going to allow us to progress up that maturity matrix. So it's a really important piece of that puzzle, and it should be stated that all of this is going to be a learning curve for every team, especially if you've never come across it before. So it's not something that you might seek to understand fully in a day or 2 days. This will be a work in progress over time, and what you'll be able to do is become really comfortable with what you're doing, maybe build up your repository with your most common metadata first, and build on top of that over time to get really comfortable with what you're doing. So there we go. That is why we need it if we're going to start unlocking some of the benefits of continuous integration and frequently deploying and making sure that our features are getting into our end users faster and delivering more value to the business faster. Now, I appreciate all of this is quite daunting. So there is a really good resource called DevOps Launchpad, which is a platform designed to, like Trailhead, to give you overview, but built specifically for Salesforce DevOps. So there is a ton of resource in there that will go into version control in more detail to help you get a better idea, little courses and modules, quizzes to get you up to speed, diagrams, the whole shebang, give you more information on DevOps testing as you kind of move down that life cycle. So if you want to know a little bit more and get a little bit more hands-on, then DevOps Launchpad is an awesome resource to help you do that. I really implore you going and checking those out. Really helpful. I hope that you found that interesting, and those objectives that we outlined at the start, to have a broad overview of what Git is, understand the benefits, and hopefully you can start to get a little bit of a picture of whether version control is going to be worth it for you or not, based on those benefits. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I would always be happy to speak to you all. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, and speak to you all soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.